In 1954, the quiet town of Belle Hollow, Tennessee, became the hunting ground of a killer so precise, so silent, that not even time could catch him. They called him the Butcher, a name whispered behind closed doors for decades. But here's the chilling part. The killings never truly stopped. Was it a ghost? A copycat? Or has the real monster been hiding in plain sight all along? Stay with us as we peel back the yellowed pages of police reports, explore the bloody trail left behind, and expose the secrets Belle Hollow tried to bury. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. Subscribe, listen closely, and don't forget to lock your doors. Belle Hollow, Tennessee, was a kind of town where nothing truly bad ever happened, or so its residents like to believe. Nestled between low hills and thick woods, it had long existed in a bubble of quiet routine. People left their doors unlocked. The sheriff's biggest worry was teenage boys racing their Chevys too fast down the main road. The town's clock tower hadn't missed a chime in 30 years. Sundays were reserved for church gossip and sweet tea on the porch. But in the early hours of June 3rd, 1954, that sense of safety was shattered forever. It began with silence, a kind of absence that felt unnatural even before anyone noticed something was wrong. Mary Ellen Carter, 19 years old and home from college this summer, hadn't come home the night before. Her parents, assuming she'd stayed at a friend's after the town dance, hadn't worried. But by dawn, her absence felt off. The Carters began calling around. No one had seen her since she left the dance alone, saying she was just walking home, barely 6 blocks through quiet, familiar streets. When the sheriff was finally called, a half-hearted search began. People expected to find Mary Ellen asleep on someone's couch, embarrassed by the fuss. But by mid-morning, a gas station attendant reported something strange. Behind the old grain silo at the edge of town, he'd seen blood. Not a smear, not a nosebleed. Pools of it, dark, congealed, soaking into the dry grass. The area was taped off, but the damage had already been done. Whispers spread faster than the sheriff could contain them. By afternoon, her body was found less than 100 feet away, laid out with deliberate, horrifying care. The details were too gruesome to print in the local paper. But behind closed doors, the town's old women wept, and its men grew pale with fury. The cuts were clean, surgical. There was no sign of struggle. No screams had been heard. Her belongings were undisturbed. Her eyes were open, frozen in what one deputy later described as a look of calm confusion, as if death had arrived too suddenly to be feared. The town held its breath. Surely it was a one-off tragedy, they hoped, a drifter, a lunatic passing through. But that hope died just 9 days later, when 12-year-old Sadie Miller disappeared on her way to deliver eggs to the pastor's house. Her basket was found by the church steps. Her body was discovered the next morning, posed in almost the exact same manner as Mary Ellen's, her hair neatly brushed, her wounds precise. The FBI was called in, though it took weeks. Meanwhile, locals armed themselves. Hardware stores ran out of locks, deadbolts, and shotgun shells. The community that had once trusted its own shadow now saw threats in every unfamiliar footstep. Even longtime neighbors looked at one another sideways. Pastors preached about the devil walking in Belle Hollow. Mothers stopped letting their daughters out of sight. The killings continued. Never rushed. Never messy. Every 3 to 4 weeks, a girl vanished. Always female. Always alone. Always someone described as sweet or well-liked. There was no sexual assault. No theft. Nothing left behind except fear and confusion. The sheriff, an aging man with decades of trust in the town, grew paranoid and erratic. He swore he saw patterns in the killings, claimed the dates lined up with lunar phases. But few took him seriously. He aged 10 years in one summer. By October, he'd resigned without explanation, moved away, and was never heard from again. As the town buried its 5th victim, Belle Hollow stopped pretending it was just a fluke. A killer was among them, one who knew the area well, one who had medical knowledge, many whispered. A butcher, others said. The name stuck. The Butcher of Belle Hollow. It sounded like something from a dime store horror novel, except it was real. It was local. And worst of all, it wasn't stopping. The police were outmatched. There were no fingerprints, no blood but the victims. No one had seen a thing. One by one, the people of Belle Hollow withdrew. Curfews were unofficially enforced. Kids were walked to school in pairs. The town dance was canceled for the first time since the war. Even Halloween that year was silent. No costumes, no candy, just locked doors and prayers whispered in the dark. What made the fear worse was how invisible the killer remained. There were no demands, no letters to the press, no look-at-me moments that typical serial killers crave. Just clinical, deliberate horror, every few weeks, always a little closer to home. Some believed the killer was a local, maybe even someone they trusted. Others thought he was a government experiment gone rogue, or a soldier back from Korea, broken and evil. None of the theories fit. By the year's end, 7 girls were dead. Belle Hollow was no longer a town. It was a wound, a quiet, bleeding place where time slowed down and shadows stretched too long. The killing stopped just before Christmas, but the damage was done. The butcher, whoever he was, had vanished, but his silence was more terrifying than the screams he never made his victims utter. And somewhere, buried deep in Belle Hollow's bloodstained soil, were answers no one dared to dig up. Mary Ellen Carter's last night alive had begun like any other small-town summer evening in Belle Hollow. The streets glowed under the amber tint of gas lamps. Music from the town hall spilled into the warm air, and the annual summer dance was in full swing. She wore a pale blue dress that had been hemmed by her mother just that morning, a pearl clip holding her hair back, and a pair of white shoes she had saved up for during the spring. By all accounts, she was happy. She had just completed her first year of college and was planning to work at the town library over the summer. She had friends. She had plans. She had no enemies. Multiple people remembered seeing her at the dance that night. She was laughing, twirling, talking with old classmates. Her presence was noticeable, bright, approachable. There was no sign of distress. She hadn't argued with anyone. She hadn't left in a rush. Sometime around 11:30 p.m., she reportedly told a friend she was heading home early. She didn't ask for a ride. Walking 6 blocks in Belle Hollow was the norm, even for a young woman. That short walk should have taken her no more than 10 minutes, but she never made it home. The path she would have taken past the old post office, a small church, and the edge of Miller's Field, an empty lot of tall grass and rusted farming equipment. At night, it was dim but not pitch black, a place most locals passed without thinking. And yet, something happened to her in that narrow stretch of Belle Hollow where no one saw and no one heard a thing. The Carters didn't panic at first. Mary Ellen had occasionally stayed over at her friend Lydia's without calling, especially if they lost track of time or didn't want to disturb their parents. But when the morning hours crept in with no sign of her, concern turned to dread. Lydia hadn't seen her. Neither had anyone else. Her bed was untouched. Her shoes were never found. The sheriff at the time, Clay McDonough, began with the usual questions. Had she run away? Was there a boyfriend involved? But there was nothing to suggest she had left on her own. Her purse was gone, but none of her belongings had been packed. Her savings remained untouched in her dresser drawer. Her diary, later reviewed by investigators, reflected the thoughts of a typical young woman. Hopes, fears, romantic daydreams, but nothing alarming. Her last entry read, "Looking forward to the dance. Maybe I'll finally get a slow one tonight." The initial hours of the investigation were slow. Volunteers were asked to comb through nearby fields and woods. The old grain silo, long abandoned, was searched. It was behind that silo where the blood was found. Thick, dark, soaking the roots of wild grass. A crime scene so quiet, so sudden, it felt almost surgical. When her body was discovered later that day, it wasn't lying where the blood had pooled. It had been moved, placed gently on a bed of moss behind a collapsed fence just off Miller's Field. Her dress was still intact, her pearl hair clip fastened in place. The coroner's report later revealed that she had been killed quickly, no signs of prolonged struggle. But what shocked investigators most were the incisions. Deep, clean, symmetrical, not jagged or frenzied like a crime of passion. These were the markings of someone who had done it before, or had practiced long enough to know how not to make mistakes. The community was devastated. Rumors began immediately. Some blamed an outsider, perhaps a traveling salesman or a circus hand passing through town. Others whispered of something more chilling, that only someone local could have known Mary Ellen's walking route, that only someone from Belle Hollow could have known exactly where to strike. Some odd details stuck out from that night, and were quietly discussed behind closed doors. The town's night watchman, who passed by Miller's Field around midnight, claimed he heard a strange metallic sound, like something dragging across metal, followed by silence. Another resident, an elderly woman with poor eyesight, reported seeing a dark vehicle parked by the field with its headlights off. Both accounts were considered unreliable and were never officially followed up. The town paper reported her death with a muted tone, calling it a tragic loss of a beloved daughter. No mention was made of the brutality. The family was left in stunned silence, burying their only child just 4 days later, surrounded by whispers and the scent of lilies. Sheriff McDonough's office assured the public that everything was under control, that leads were being pursued. But behind closed doors, there was nothing. No motive, no suspect, no fingerprints. Just a lifeless girl in a peaceful town now drowning in paranoia. The night Mary Ellen disappeared marked the first true break in Belle Hollow's sense of safety. People stopped walking alone. Fathers began picking up their daughters from school. Local shopkeepers started closing early. The trust that once defined the town dissolved in a matter of days. Something evil had passed to the heart of Belle Hollow, or worse, had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Mary Ellen Carter became the first name etched into the unofficial list of victims. But she wouldn't be the last. Her murder opened the door to a darkness Belle Hollow never imagined could exist. And once that door was open, it refused to close again. The killing of Mary Ellen Carter shook Belle Hollow to its core, but what followed confirmed something far more chilling. Her murder was not a crime of passion, nor the random act of disturbed passerby. It was the beginning of a pattern, precise, calculated, and utterly remorseless. Just 9 days later, when 12-year-old Sadie Miller disappeared and was found the next morning, the town was forced to confront a terrifying truth. Belle Hollow had a serial killer, and this one was leaving behind a message, not with words, but with blood, wounds, and ritual. Sadie's body was discovered near the old sawmill, her pose almost identical to Mary Ellen's. She had been carefully laid out, arms crossed over her chest, eyes open, and mouth gently closed. Her injuries matched those of Mary Ellen in nearly every way. Deep, symmetrical cuts, no bruising, no sign of a struggle, and no indication of sexual assault. It was as if the killer was demonstrating a form of control, not just over the victim, but over the entire town. What had once felt random now looked methodical. This wasn't rage. It was design. The medical examiner, a quiet man named Dr. Jonas Bell, noted something peculiar in his report. Each cut had been made post-mortem cleanly and deliberately. The wounds had a surgical quality, as if performed by someone with anatomical knowledge. Though rudimentary compared to professional autopsy incisions, they were precise enough to suggest either medical training or a disturbing amount of practice. And in both victims, the exact same internal organs had been tampered with. The liver was exposed but not removed, and a thin incision had been made around the heart. To Dr. Bell, it felt symbolic, as though the killer was dissecting not just bodies, but something more profound. The media didn't catch on immediately. Local newspapers handled the details delicately, concerned more with maintaining calm than exposing truth. But in hushed rooms and behind trembling lips, the whispers began. People started calling the killer the Butcher. It wasn't an official title. It was a name born of fear, fitting, cold, and unforgettable. The idea that someone could commit such atrocities without leaving behind any evidence haunted every household in Belle Hollow. Law enforcement, already out of its depth, grew desperate. Sheriff McDonough, though committed, was facing a case he couldn't comprehend. No fingerprints, no footprints, no witnesses. The only consistent clues were the condition and arrangement of the bodies, and those clues felt less like breadcrumbs and more like warnings. Deputies began to look for patterns, victim profiles, geographic links. But nothing connected Mary Ellen and Sadie beyond the fact that they had both walked alone in quiet areas and were deeply loved by their communities. Then came the third murder. Eileen Roberts, 23, was a newlywed and Sunday school teacher. Her husband reported her missing one evening after she failed to return from visiting her sister just 2 blocks away. Her body was found the next morning behind the abandoned textile factory. The same presentation, the same wounds, the same absence of struggle. By now, the town's fear had fully curdled into paranoia. But this time there was something new, something deliberate, something the killer wanted someone to see. Carved into the ground beneath Eileen's body was a single symbol, a circle with an X through it, roughly scratched into the dirt with what appeared to be the end of a coat hanger or knife tip. It was faint but unmistakable. Dr. Bell identified it as neither medical nor religious. The sheriff couldn't link it to any known gang or cult, but its placement, directly under the spine, suggested it was meant to be found. It wasn't just a message. It was a calling card. That symbol reappeared with the next victim, and the next, each time more precisely carved. In some cases, it was etched on nearby walls or fences. In others, it was dug into the soil or scratched onto wooden surfaces. The butcher was escalating, not in violence, but in confidence, leaving his mark, owning the scene, as if claiming each location as sacred ground for his own ritual. The FBI, finally pressured by regional outcry, sent 2 agents to assist. They reviewed the autopsy photos, mapped the body locations, and studied the wounds in grim silence. One agent, who had previously worked on a case involving a rural necrophiliac, said this didn't fit that pattern. There was no sexual motive, no desecration for pleasure. This was about control, dominance, and something darker, possibly even ideological. What disturbed the agents most was the spacing of the murders. Each took place exactly 9 to 11 days apart, always on a Tuesday or Thursday, always during the early hours of the morning. It was as if the killer operated on a ritualistic schedule, a twisted calendar known only to him. And no matter how many officers patrolled the streets, no one ever heard a scream. No one ever saw a struggle. It was like the victims simply vanished from reality for a few minutes, then reappeared lifeless and marked. Belle Hollow was no longer searching for a motive. It was searching for salvation. The symbol soon appeared in drawings by children who hadn't been near the crime scenes, in chalk on school walls, in fogged-up windows. The butcher had carved his fear into the town's subconscious. Every locked door, every flickering light, every set of footsteps behind someone in the dark became his voice. And his message was clear. He was in control. He was watching, and the blood was just beginning to spill. The early murders in Belle Hollow might have been mistaken for isolated horrors, gruesome but without connection. Yet by the time the 4th body was discovered, no one doubted that a pattern had emerged, not just in method, but in something more haunting, a cold, deliberate rhythm. The killer wasn't acting on impulse. He was following a blueprint. What made the butcher unlike other known serial killers was extraordinary consistency in his process. Every victim was discovered within a narrow window of time, between 3 o'clock and 4:30 a.m. Every abduction occurred within walking distance of the victim's home. Every recovery site was secluded, but not hidden, always just far enough from roads and homes to delay discovery without entirely preventing it. It was as though he wanted the bodies to be found, but only after he had finished whatever message he was inscribing into them. The wounds remained consistent, almost textbook in execution. Clean cuts, always in the same locations, beneath the ribs, along the inner thighs, down the forearms. No excessive bleeding at the scene. No defensive wounds. The coroner's findings suggested either sedation before death or an immediate, fatal blow that left no chance to resist. It was surgical, not just in technique, but in psychology. The butcher had no interest in chaos or spectacle. His actions were purposeful, as if he was performing a ritual. The introduction of the carved symbol beneath the 3rd victim was the first tangible link to something more abstract. The circle with an X, simple, untraceable, yet intentional, became his personal monogram. It began appearing in more sophisticated ways. One was etched onto a victim's compact mirror, another drawn in blood on a fence post. In one case, the killer used flour from a nearby shed to trace it into the grass. He wanted it seen. It was never hidden, never ambiguous. It was a seal, a silent claim. Beyond the physical signs, the timeline of the killings offered another clue. The murders occurred in a rhythm that mirrored phases of the moon. Victims disappeared within 3 days of either a full moon or new moon. At first dismissed as coincidence, this correlation became harder to ignore as more bodies were discovered. Whether the lunar cycle held any personal significance to the killer or served as a countdown of sorts, no one could say. But it suggested a ritualistic cadence that separated the butcher from opportunistic predators. Further, the choice of victims became another grim detail in his signature. All were female, all between the ages of 12 and 27. All described as kind, soft-spoken, religious, or well-liked. None had any known enemies. There was no shared workplace, no shared social circle, no shared bloodline. Yet they all embodied a certain archetype, a kind of small-town purity, innocence, or light. It began to seem as if the butcher wasn't killing specific individuals, but rather hunting a certain image of virtue. He wasn't destroying people. He was erasing symbols. Despite mounting fear and national media attention, the killer never deviated. Even when law enforcement flooded the area, even as armed neighbors patrolled their streets in shifts, the murders continued on schedule. There were no sudden bursts of violence, no signs of panic, no deviation in technique. The silence in which he operated was its own statement. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He simply continued methodically, like a metronome of death ticking beneath the town's surface. Attempt at profiling the killer yielded few results. The FBI suspected a local, someone quiet, observant, perhaps even professionally respected. The surgical nature of the cuts led many to believe he had some medical or veterinary background. Others argued he might have been a mortician or a butcher in the literal sense. But with no witnesses and no surviving victims, speculation filled the gaps where evidence failed. Adding to the pattern was his uncanny ability to vanish. No tire marks, no boot prints, no stray hairs or fibers. It was as though he floated between scenes, guided by some internal compass only he could read. Investigators began to suspect he planned not just the killings, but the aftermath, choosing locations that limited environmental evidence, timing the discoveries to create maximum fear, and leaving just enough behind to ensure his myth would grow stronger with every body. Over time, a chilling realization settled in. The butcher was not trying to be caught, nor was he trying to escape. He existed within the town, either hiding in plain sight or tucked just beyond its borders. And with every murder, his control deepened. The town's behavioral shifts became part of the pattern. The curfews, the locked doors, the hushed voices. He wasn't just killing people. He was shaping Belle Hollow in his image. Local churches filled the capacity, yet prayers gave no relief. Some believed the killer was possessed. Others feared he was some dark messenger, punishing the town for sins buried in its history. A few believed he was an old resident returned from war, broken in ways no one could see. But these were just theories, desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable. What remained was the undeniable pattern. Ritualistic violence, precision beyond rage, and silence deeper than death. The butcher didn't just kill, he composed. Each murder was a verse in a poem only he understood. And as more bodies filled the cold earth of Belle Hollow, one thing became clear. This wasn't madness. It was method. As the body count in Belle Hollow climbed, a grim responsibility settled on the shoulders of one man, Dr. Jonas Bell, the town's only coroner. A quiet, disciplined figure in his late 50s, Bell had seen his share of tragic deaths over the years. Accidents, farm injuries, the occasional suicide. But nothing had prepared him for the precision and horror that marked the butcher's trail. With every autopsy, Dr. Bell grew more convinced that this was not just a killer, but a mind meticulously at work. A mind sending a message through flesh. The first autopsy, performed on Mary Ellen Carter, had raised immediate concerns. Her death, while quick, showed an almost clinical efficiency. There were no broken bones, no bruises, no torn clothing. Her vital organs had been exposed, but not removed. A careful incision below the rib cage, a cut so clean it could have come from a medical textbook, allowed Dr. Belle to examine her liver, kidneys, and heart without needing to make further incisions himself. He noted that the knife used was incredibly sharp, possibly a scalpel or custom blade. More disturbingly, there were no hesitation marks, no sign that the killer was experimenting or uncertain. When Sadie Miller's body arrived on the coroner's table, the similarities were unmistakable. The same areas of the body had been targeted. Again, the wounds appeared post-mortem. Again, the internal organs had been precisely exposed without excessive damage. What differed was Sadie's age and size, yet the incisions were just as exact. The killer had adjusted his method to the anatomy of a child with terrifying proficiency. Dr. Belle began documenting the patterns in fine detail. Angles, depths, the exact length between cuts. What emerged wasn't just repetition. It was refinement. The third and fourth victims showed signs that chilled Belle to his core. The killer was not only consistent, he was evolving. In both cases, Belle discovered small tissue samples missing from the same region of the heart. The removals were careful, nearly invisible at first glance, but precise enough to suggest intent. They weren't trophies. There was no sign of mutilation or scattering. These were controlled extractions, as if the killer were collecting specific biological data, or worse, creating a ritual of symbolic significance. Dr. Belle began comparing the autopsies in detail, overlaying photographs and measurements. The positioning of the incisions followed a mirrored pattern, almost geometric. Victims' bodies, though found in different locations, had been laid out with similar spinal alignment, as if following a set of rules. He considered the possibility of occult symbolism, even sketching the overlapping wounds on translucent sheets. A pattern began to take shape, a radial symmetry that echoed the symbol left beneath one of the bodies. Belle noted that the cuts formed angles which, if connected with lines, resembled a primitive compass rose. What disturbed him most wasn't the violence. It was the quiet control behind it. There was no panic, no rage in these cuts. Whoever the butcher was, he knew what he was doing and why. Belle suspected military or surgical training, but something didn't fit. The precision was there, but so was something else, something artistic. He began to describe the killer's method as ritualistic anatomy, not medical, not sadistic, but ceremonial. The removal of tissue, the positioning, the silence, it all pointed to a killer who believed he was performing something far greater than murder. Belle started keeping separate notes from the official autopsy reports. Private observations he feared would be dismissed as paranoia or hysteria. In these notes, he detailed things others overlooked. The unusual absence of livor mortis in some cases, as if the bodies had been chilled or preserved briefly before being staged. A faint scent on the victim's hair that resembled formaldehyde, though none had been embalmed. And peculiar absence of insects or decay, even when a body was left exposed overnight. Nature itself seemed hesitant to touch what the butcher had claimed. When the fifth body arrived, Belle made a fateful decision. He took a sample of the incision site and sent it, anonymously, to a pathology lab in Memphis. The results came back inconclusive, but noted something strange. Trace elements of an unknown preservative compound were detected in the surrounding tissue. It wasn't a chemical typically used in medicine or embalming. It was something else, something synthetic, something unregistered. Dr. Belle never reported that test result to the authorities. The fear that gripped the town was mirrored in the isolation Belle began to feel. He knew he was dealing with something more than a murderer. He stopped speaking about the case in detail, stopped attending church, started sleeping at the morgue. When questioned, he claimed he didn't want to be followed home. But the truth was simpler. The morgue was the only place where the butcher's language could be read clearly, where the story was written in sinew and silence. Eventually, Belle came to a disturbing realization. The butcher didn't just leave behind victims. He left behind messages, written not in blood, but in anatomical arrangement. He was telling someone something. The symbols, the precision, the preservation, they weren't meant for the town. They were meant for someone who could understand them. And as the death toll rose, one question echoed through the sterile halls, the more loudly than any other. What if that someone was him? By the time the sixth victim was discovered, The murders had become a grim rhythm that Belle Hollow could neither stop nor understand. But amid the horror, there came a subtle fracture in the pattern, a break that began not with blood, but with absence. 3 girls disappeared over a span of 5 weeks, and unlike the previous cases, their bodies were never recovered. Their names, Ruth Langley, Claire Dorsey, and Abigail Fenn, became phantoms in the town's collective memory. Their stories, though similar to those who have been found, were also different in one deeply disturbing way. They vanished without a trace. Each of the 3 was last seen alone and walking, just like the other victims. Ruth had been returning from her aunt's house. Claire had stayed late at the school library. Abigail had been on her way home from church choir. All were seen only minutes before they disappeared. And yet, when the town awoke the next day, they were simply gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, no symbols, no message, just silence. Authorities initially assumed the girls would turn up the same way the others had, arranged, displayed, marked. The town braced itself. Search parties were organized. Roadsides, creeks, and barns were combed. Volunteers marked trees and fences with red ribbons to signal they had been checked. But as days turned to weeks, hope dissolved into dread. The girls weren't turning up. The killer had either changed tactics or found a new reason to keep them. The disappearances threw off the timeline investigators had begun to rely on. The butcher's pattern, once so rigid, had suddenly gone quiet. No new victims. No signs. The circle with an X symbol did not reappear. The community was left in limbo, unsure if the killer had vanished or was simply building towards something worse. The quiet felt suffocating. In some ways, it was even more terrifying than the murders. But it was Abigail Fenn's disappearance that shifted the narrative. Unlike the others, she had been carrying something when she vanished, a worn leather Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. Her father, a local carpenter, insisted that Abigail never went anywhere without it. A week after she went missing, that Bible was found wedged behind the back pew of the old Methodist church. It had not been there earlier. The pages were intact, the name Abigail Fenn still etched in the inner cover. But something had been added, a torn scrap of paper folded into the spine. On it, drawn in red ink, was a familiar circle and X symbol. Below it, a single word had been scrawled: obedience. The sheriff's department kept this detail from the public, fearing panic and hysteria. But among law enforcement and the FBI agents still assigned to the case, the word shifted everything. Until then, the murders had appeared ritualistic but silent. Now, there was a suggestion of intention, a philosophy, even. The killer was no longer simply marking his work. He was speaking. A theory began to form. What if the 3 missing girls weren't failed attempts? What if they were different for a reason? The word obedience implied submission, acceptance, perhaps even cooperation. Investigators speculated that the killer had changed his approach. Maybe he was testing new victims for compliance. Maybe he no longer needed to kill to make his point. Or worse, maybe these girls had passed an unspoken test. The FBI's behavioral analysts became obsessed with the similarities between the 3 girls. All 3 were deeply religious, involved in church activities, and known for their obedience to authority. Unlike previous victims, who were quiet but independent, these 3 had reputations for strict adherence to rules, parental obedience, and moral discipline. The word began to take on weight, not just as a message, but as a filter. The killer, it seemed, was no longer selecting victims based solely on vulnerability. He was judging them. Some speculated that these girls were being kept alive somewhere, either as captives or as participants in some unknown psychological ritual. Others believed the killer had shifted to a symbolic form of control, choosing not to kill those who fit his ideal, but instead using their disappearance to further his message. It was a chilling evolution. Murder had been a warning. Now, obedience might be a reward. Families grew more desperate. Lockdowns became common. Religious leaders offered prayer vigils and sermons on purity, morality, and faith. But there was an unspoken fear lingering behind every closed door. What if obedience was no longer a virtue, but a requirement for survival? What if the killer was shaping his victims into something new? Then, something even stranger occurred. 2 weeks after Abigail's Bible was found, a letter was delivered to the sheriff's office without a return address. It contained no writing, only a hand-drawn map. The location was familiar: the woods behind Belle Hollow Cemetery. Officers searched the area and found nothing at first, but buried beneath a patch of disturbed soil, they uncovered a single object: a pocket watch. It belonged to Ruth Langley's grandfather. She had borrowed it on the day she disappeared. Again, no blood, no body, just a trace, a marker, a message. The killer had left behind no clear answers, only pieces of a puzzle that grew darker with each new clue. While the town mourned its lost daughters, others began to wonder: had the butcher stopped killing, or had he discovered a more powerful way to control? And if obedience was the key, then what came next was not just murder. It was doctrine. The months following the disappearances of Ruth, Claire, and Abigail transformed Belle Hollow from a town into a fortress. Once defined by its porch lights and neighborly smiles, the community became gripped by an unrelenting, bone-deep fear. Families no longer trusted each other. Streets that once echoed with laughter and bicycle bells fell silent. The killer's presence was not just felt, it was internalized, reshaping daily life customs and even identity. Fear became the new religion. Curfews were no longer advised. They were enforced not by police, but by fathers with shotguns and mothers who whispered rules like scripture. Children were no longer allowed outside after dusk. Teens who once lingered at soda fountains were now ushered home like prisoners, their movements watched, tracked, and limited. The town's sense of freedom collapsed under invisible chains, welded together by silence, speculation, and evil that refused to show its face. Hardware stores sold out of locks and deadbolts in days. Every door had a new chain latch. Every window bore freshly cut planks nailed into place. The sound of hammers and drills replaced Sunday hymns. People armed themselves not out of courage, but desperation. Shotguns replaced by doors, baseball bats under beds, and hunting rifles leaned beside rocking chairs that no longer rocked. And despite all these measures, there was a terrible, whispered truth in every home. Deep down, they knew none of it would matter. No one had ever heard the killer coming. No one had ever seen him leave. He bypassed locks, avoided detection, and left behind only carefully arranged bodies and symbols that felt more like curses and clues. Protection felt like a pantomime, something people did to feel less helpless, not because they believed it would actually stop him. The sheriff's department, overwhelmed and largely ineffective, tried to impose order. A dusk-to-dawn curfew was announced. Patrol cars were dispatched in rotating shifts, but the officers were just as terrified as the citizens they served. With no clear leads, they resorted to theater: flashing lights, loudspeaker announcements, warnings of arrests, anything to appear in control. Deep down, everyone knew the truth. The butcher was not afraid of badges. Churches became sanctuaries, not just spiritual ones, but physical shelters. Evening masses grew in attendance, not out of devotion, but fear. Families came not to pray, but to sit together under bright lights in a public space, hoping the killer wouldn't strike where so many eyes could see. Sermons shifted from salvation to survival. Pastors no longer preached heaven. They preached caution. The messages were clear: obey the curfew, trust no stranger, and if you hear a noise at night, do not open the door. Businesses began to suffer. Shops closed early, some permanently. The town's economy, once modest and stable, crumbled as fear devoured routine. People stopped spending money on anything but essentials. The local theater, once a beacon of youth and joy, shut down indefinitely after a string of empty shows. No one wanted to sit in the dark anymore, even for 90 minutes. The mayor pleaded for calm in radio interviews, but his voice cracked under the pressure, betraying the same fear he told others to resist. What fear couldn't control, it warped. People turned on one another. Suspicion infected the community. Outsiders were no longer welcomed. They were feared, followed, sometimes even confronted in the street. A traveling salesman was beaten unconscious outside a diner, simply because no one recognized his car. Longtime neighbors began to avoid eye contact. Children were pulled out of school, homeschooled behind boarded windows. Rumors spread like wildfire, each more fantastical than the last. Some claimed the butcher was a former soldier, a ghost, a devil, or worse, one of them. Friendships fractured, marriages strained. The mere mention of a family member walking outside alone was enough to ignite an argument. People began keeping personal logs of every sound, every passing car, every flickering light bulb. Fear transformed into obsession. Some residents turned to alcohol. Others turned to faith. A few vanished in the night, not by murder, but by leaving Belle Hollow entirely, unwilling to endure what the town had become. And through it all, the butcher remained silent. No new bodies, no symbols, no letters. But the absence of violence felt more ominous than the crimes themselves. The town waited, flinched, listened for the silence that came before the discovery of death. It never came. The quiet stretched on, suffocating and dense. The pause in killings felt like a held breath, an invisible countdown no one could read. Belle Hollow became a portrait of psychological decay, a place defined not by what had happened, but by what might. Its residents stopped living and started enduring. Joy was replaced by routine. Hope was replaced by doubt. The town had not just lost its daughters. It had lost its identity. The butcher had done more than take lives. He had changed what it meant to be from Belle Hollow. He had rewritten the community's sense of self, turned neighbor into suspect and home into prison. His greatest weapon was no longer the knife. It was the waiting. And as the days stretched on with no new murder, the fear only deepened. Because everyone in Belle Hollow knew something terrible that no one dared to say out loud. It was too quiet. In the thick fog of fear that had settled over Belle Hollow, the last place anyone expected clarity to emerge was inside a confessional booth. The churches in town had become safe havens, not because they provided answers, but because they were among the few places where people could breathe without looking over their shoulders. But in early November of 1954, a confession whispered behind closed wood and glass shattered the uneasy silence and injected a jolt of terror back into a town barely holding itself together. The confession was first heard by Father Thomas Whitley, a priest known for his soft voice and unshakable calm. He had served the town for over 20 years and had baptized many of the very girls who had since been murdered. He had stood at their funerals, prayed over their graves. Now, someone had stepped into his sanctuary claiming to know something. But what was spoken was not a straightforward admission. It was cryptic, unsettling, and fragmented. The individual, never seen, only heard, spoke in hushed, shaking tones. He did not confess to murder. Instead, he confessed to understanding. He spoke of patterns in nature, symmetry in the flesh, and balance in sacrifice. He said the girls were chosen not by him, but by a greater necessity. He claimed to be a vessel, not a perpetrator. He spoke of obedience, not violence, of purity, not death. And as he spoke, he wept, not from remorse, but reverence. Father Whitley, sworn to silence by the sacrament of confession, could not reveal the identity of the speaker, even if he had known it. The voice was muffled, distorted by the booth's thick divider. But the content of the confession disturbed him enough to act outside the bounds of protocol. That night, he wrote down every word he could recall. Not in a church record, but in a private journal. The journal was later found, years after his death, by his successor, but at the time, the only thing Father Whitley could do was hint, cautiously and vaguely, to local authorities that someone had come forward in spirit, if not in name. The sheriff dismissed it at first, a religious delusion, the ramblings of a grief-stricken soul. But when Whitley mentioned one specific detail that had never been released to public, that changed everything. The confessor had spoken of a missing object, a necklace belonging to Claire Dorsey, one of the vanished girls. The pendant was described exactly, a brass oval locket with a chipped hinge and a photograph of Claire's late brother inside. It had never been mentioned in police reports or news stories. Only Claire's family and the sheriff's office knew it existed. And now, someone had spoken of it in a whisper between wood and shadow. The implication was terrifying. Whoever had made the confession had seen that necklace, possibly held it. If he wasn't the killer, he was dangerously close to him. The sheriff quietly sent 2 officers to observe the church for the following week. Every visitor was noted, especially those who entered late or alone. But nothing conclusive came of it. No one returned to the booth with further confession. The church remained silent, its pews filled with frightened parishioners unaware that one of them, or some among them, may have been the vessel of something monstrous. The content of confession wasn't just disturbing. It aligned too closely with details the FBI had been piecing together. The references to symmetry and balance mirrored the autopsy findings. The mention of sacrifice hinted at the killer's motive being something more than hatred or perversion. The word obedience echoed what had been found in Abigail Fenn's Bible. It was no longer just a crime spree. It was theology, a belief system wrapped in death. Speculation exploded in private. Some believed the killer was confessing anonymously to relieve guilt without exposure. Others thought the confession was a taunt, a game, a ritual step in a larger pattern. A few even believed the killer was not confessing, but preaching, using the booth as a pulpit. And if that were true, the implications were even worse. He saw himself as not only untouchable but righteous. What haunted Father Whitley most wasn't the words themselves, but the tone in which they were spoken. The voice wasn't angry. It was devout, calm, sincere. The person had not come to ask for forgiveness. He had come to share truth, as he saw it, and that made the evil feel deeper, more insidious. This wasn't madness. This was conviction. Weeks passed with no new confessions, no new bodies, just a town boiling with paranoia and now unsure if the butcher walked among them not as a shadow, but as a fellow worshiper. The church was no longer safe. The confessional was no longer sacred. Trust in every institution, law, faith, friendship, was unraveling. And though the confessor had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, one phrase he spoke lingered in Whitley's memory like a cold wind in the rafters of the chapel. You don't bury the chosen. You release them. Abigail Fenn was the third girl to vanish without a trace. Her absence marked the tipping point in Belle Hollow's descent into fear, and her name became a symbol of the town's helplessness. Her Bible, recovered weeks after she disappeared, was seen as the only clue she had left behind, until her diary surfaced. The battered cloth-bound book had been hidden inside a loose panel in her bedroom wall, wedged behind the edge of a hollow beam. It was found by accident during a quiet search by her father who, in the depths of grief, was checking every crevice of the house for something, anything, that might explain where his daughter had gone. The diary was small, no larger than a palm, with curled pages and ink that faded in places from handling in time. Unlike most teenage journals filled with crushes, dreams, and observations, Abigail's writing was restrained, orderly, and often unsettlingly mature for a 15-year-old girl. She had been quiet in life, dutiful, devout, but in her private words, a different Abigail emerged, curious, conflicted, and quietly terrified by something she never fully named. The entries began innocently enough. Thoughts about school, moments from church, brief descriptions of books she liked or chores she found boring. But by mid-August, just 2 weeks before her disappearance, the tone changed. Her sentences grew shorter, the language more coded. She began writing about the silence behind the church and the man who stands without moving. The entries stopped including names. People were referred to by symbols. R for Ruth, C for Claire, T for the tall one, a person she never clearly identified. She began referring to recurring dreams. In one entry, she described waking to find her window open when she was sure she had locked it. Another noted that her shoes had been moved 6 inches from where she left them. At first, she questioned herself, thinking she was imagining things or forgetting small details. But then she wrote a line that chilled even seasoned investigators. He doesn't knock. He waits. He watches to see if I understand. Over the course of several pages, she referenced a mark without ever specifying what it was. Once she wrote, Claire said it's not a mark. It's a map, a gate if you know how to read it. Claire Dorsey, another of the missing girls, had evidently shared something with Abigail, perhaps information or perhaps fear. But Claire's diary, if it existed, was never found. Abigail's continued for a few more entries before it turned almost frantic. The neat handwriting became erratic. She stopped writing in paragraphs and started listing phrases in strange patterns. One page read, Obedience is the invitation. She sang and he followed. Moonlight on the steps again. Ruth went first. I saw the cross but not the circle. And then, abruptly, one entry read only. He listens better when you're alone. Following that entry, the diary returned to a single paragraph, dated just 3 days before Abigail disappeared. It read, "They say death is loud, but I think it's a folding, like fabric." He showed me the difference between noise and meaning. He told me I was already chosen. He said I was born under Black Crescent, and that means I belong to the quiet. Not because I'm weak, because I hear what others ignore. The final page had no date, only the symbol, a circle with an X drawn in shaky ink, and underneath it, a single word, ready. That word turned the diary from a simple record into a potential manifesto. Investigators debated its meaning. Was Abigail willingly stepping into the killer's hands? Was she manipulated into believing she had a destiny? Or had she discovered something so dark that surrender felt like the only path forward? Psychologists who reviewed the diary described it as the work of someone who had undergone a gradual psychological transformation. Not a breakdown, but a shift, as though someone had been guiding her perception quietly, invisibly, over time, nudging her toward a conclusion she hadn't questioned until it became belief. There were no signs of abuse, no obvious trauma, only layers of persuasion. The diary introduced a terrifying idea into the investigation. The butcher was not just a killer. He was a teacher, a recruiter, maybe even a prophet in his own mind. And Abigail, far from a passive victim, might have been drawn into something voluntarily, mentally, spiritually, or symbolically. The missing girls were no longer just abducted. They might have been converted. Belle Hollow, upon hearing rumors of the diary's contents, splintered even further. Parents no longer allowed their children to read anything outside of school. Pastors denounced false visions. Teachers were ordered to remove symbols from bulletin boards. And among the few who had read the original diary, one question lingered in every conversation. If Abigail believed she was ready, what exactly had she been preparing for? After nearly 2 months of silence, Belle Hollow had started to breathe again. Shallow, cautious breaths, but breaths nonetheless. The curfews remained, and the fear never fully receded. Yet in the absence of new blood, a strange and fragile routine began to take hold. Some believed the killer had fled. Others whispered that he had claimed enough souls and moved on. For a brief window, the darkness felt dormant. Then, on a cold December morning, that illusion was shattered. The body was discovered just past the northern fence of the Miller farm, lying between a pair of dead birch trees. The snow had barely begun to fall the night before, and when it melted slightly in the early dawn, it revealed what the frost had tried to conceal. A girl, posed in a now familiar manner, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes open to the gray sky above. Her name was Naomi Price. She had been missing for 12 hours. The method was unmistakable. Identical incision patterns. No signs of restraint or struggle. No trace of forced entry at her home, and no defensive wounds. The surgical precision had returned, marking her body like a signature. There were no footprints, no tire tracks. The crime scene, like those before it, felt more like a stage than a place of death. The butcher hadn't just returned. He had done so with clarity, purpose, and renewed confidence. But there was one difference. Pinned to Naomi's chest was a note, typed, folded once, and held in place with a silver pin pressed to the collar of her blouse. It was short, with no signature and no smudges. The message read, "Your silence birthed faith. Let the faithful now see." It was the first time the killer had used typed words. The town had long suspected he was trying to communicate through symbols, positioning, and ritual, but now he had spoken plainly, directly. The meaning, though cryptic, carried a strange authority. It sounded more like doctrine than explanation, more decree than confession, and it confirmed what many feared. This was no longer simply a spree of murders. It had become a form of expression. Forensic analysis of the paper turned up nothing. No prints, no fibers. The ink matched a standard ribbon from any number of commercial typewriters. The pen was traced to a local general store, but the batch had been sold in bulk, untraceable. Once again, the butcher had left behind a message without a trail. Naomi's background deepened the unease. She was 17, a member of the same choir as Abigail Fenn, and had once attended a religious retreat with Claire Dorsey. Though no clear relationship had ever been established between the missing girls, Naomi's connections revived an earlier theory. The victims were being selected based on shared belief systems or exposure to a common ideology, one that may have already been at work long before the killings began. Autopsy reports showed something even more disturbing. Unlike the previous victims, Naomi's internal organs had not only been exposed, they had been rearranged. Not removed, not mutilated, but shifted. Her heart was slightly displaced from its cavity. Her liver was angled differently. Even her intestines had been coiled in a pattern the coroner described as unnatural but deliberate. It was not the work of someone trying to conceal a crime. It was the work of someone crafting a message. When these details reached the FBI, they immediately returned to Belle Hollow. The delay between murders had been deceptive. The killer hadn't stopped, he had evolved. He had grown bolder, more sophisticated, and more intentional in his designs. The rearrangement of Naomi's organs was interpreted as symbolic, as though the killer were writing something not in language, but in anatomy. Some saw the arrangement as resembling the same symbol, the circle with the X. Others saw something more arcane. A few believed the new pattern mimicked ancient sacrificial diagrams used in fringe esoteric rituals. Though experts debated the interpretation, no one could deny the conclusion. The butcher was no longer simply making statements. He was constructing a theology, piece by piece, body by body. The return of the killing sparked a second wave of hysteria. The curfews hardened. Households that had begun to relax regressed into fear. The local newspaper, the Belle Hollow Tribune, printed the typed note across its front page with the headline, "The faithful now see." Public opinion turned quickly against law enforcement and even the clergy. People demanded answers, arrests, explanations. But there were none. No leads. No suspects. Just one more girl dead, and a message so vague it became a canvas for every fear the town refused to speak aloud. For some, Naomi's death marked the beginning of a second phase, a shift in the killer's timeline, motive, or purpose. For others, it was a reminder that the butcher had never left. He had simply paused, perhaps to plan, perhaps to watch. And now, having studied the silence, he had decided it was time to act again. And if the first wave of murders was about ritual, this one was about revelation. The discovery of Naomi Price's body didn't just restart the horror in Belle Hollow. It reframed the entire case. For months, the town had focused on emotional and ritualistic components of the murders, the symmetry, the religious overtones, the silence. But it wasn't until a group of forensic cartographers arrived from out of state that a new theory was born, one that connected the killer not to theology or madness, but to something older, colder, and meticulously calculated: geometry. At the suggestion of a behavioral analyst, law enforcement shared all recovery site coordinates with a team specializing in spatial forensics. What emerged from that data stunned investigators. When the known victim locations were plotted on a scaled topographic map of Belle Hollow and its surroundings, the result was not random. The sites formed precise points along intersecting lines that mimicked ancient geometric forms, most notably a pentagram. The alignment wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to discard coincidence. With Naomi's body completing one final angle, the lines clicked into place. Every body had been left at the outer tips of a five-pointed structure with mathematical symmetry. The symbol didn't match modern satanic imagery or occult pentacles. It resembled something older, pre-Christian, rooted in sacred geometry, and historically associated with ancient agricultural and spiritual rites. When the lines were extended inward, they intersected near the town's geographic center, just 2 miles from the Belle Hollow Cemetery. Specifically, they converged near a small hill marked only by a half-collapsed stone foundation and a rusted iron fence. The area had no known ownership, no official designation, and wasn't listed on modern property records. To locals, it was referred to simply as Old Grove Hill. Few remembered the location's history. Fewer still dared to go there. Some believed it had once housed a church or a mill, others a Civil War outpost. Over time, Nature had reclaimed it, and memory had buried it. But the map did not lie. The killer had been working toward that center, converging every victim around that one point. Investigators visited Old Grove Hill the day after the pattern was discovered. What they found deepened the mystery. At the center of the collapsed structure stood a single stone slab, rectangular, cracked with age, and covered in lichen. Beneath the dirt, carved into its face, was a nearly identical symbol to the one the butcher had drawn, a circle with a cross-like X running through its core. It had not been added recently. The stone had been weathered over decades. Whoever carved the symbol had done so long before the killings began. And yet, the butcher had mirrored it perfectly, down to the angles, the proportions, the shape of the inner cross. The implication was staggering. Either he had discovered this site and adopted its symbol as his own, or he had known it all along. The geometric alignment, combined with the presence of the stone, gave rise to a new theory. The killings were not random acts of violence, but the components of a massive, long-form ritual with spatial precision, a slow construction of meaning written into the very landscape of Belle Hollow. Each murder had not simply desecrated a life, but consecrated a point. The town had become a canvas, and the killer was drawing something into its soil. The use of geometry in ritual sacrifice isn't new to history. Cultures across time, Babylonian, Celtic, Egyptian, believed in the alignment of death and earth to amplify spiritual purpose. They drew shapes with stone, blood, fire, and shadow. They arranged altars with care, believing the land could be made to speak or summon. And in Belle Hollow, someone was attempting to do the same. The FBI's occult crime unit was consulted. Their analysis added another disturbing layer. The choice of victims wasn't only symbolic. It was spatially optimized. Every girl had lived at a location that, when connected to the next, maintained even angular distance from Old Grove Hill. The butcher had not only selected targets based on belief or innocence, he had selected them based on their placement on the land. He was treating the town as an altar. Each body had become a cornerstone in a larger structure, an invisible cathedral of silence and death. And Old Grove Hill, long forgotten, has stood silently at the center like the eye of a storm waiting to open. The realization spread panic. Once more, people feared that another death wasn't just inevitable, it was required. A final sacrifice to complete whatever structure the butcher believed he was building. Sheriff's deputies were stationed around the hill day and night, but it changed nothing. The butcher had never worked in the open. He had never needed direct access to Old Grove Hill. He had already shaped the ritual around it, step by step, life by life, with patience that bordered on inhuman. The soil of Belle Hollow was no longer innocent. It had been marked, cut, and aligned. And with Naomi's death, the lines had closed. The shape had formed. The symbol had awakened. And somewhere, the butcher was watching, not as a predator, but as an architect. Dr. Jonas Bell had been a silent witness to every horror that passed through Belle Hollow. As the town's only coroner, he had examined every victim of the butcher, documented each incision, measured every angle, and quietly recorded details too disturbing for public knowledge. His silence had always been seen as professionalism, but when he failed to report for duty in mid-December, weeks after discovery of Naomi Price, concern quickly escalated into fear. Authorities found his home empty, but not abandoned. His coat still hung by the door. The bed was unmade. A kettle had boiled dry on the stove, leaving a scorched ring on the burner. There was no sign of forced entry, no blood, no note. The only clue was a reel-to-reel tape recorder set up in his study, left powered on but silent, until investigators rewound the tape. What they heard was not a suicide note, nor a confession. It was a slow, deliberate documentation, a message intended not for friends or family, but for anyone willing to understand what Dr. Bell had uncovered. Over the course of 28 minutes, he spoke calmly, clinically, and at times almost reverently, piecing together the truth he believed the town was not ready to face. Dr. Bell began by revisiting his earliest observations, the strange consistency of the wounds, the lack of hesitation marks, and the absence of defensive injuries. He reiterated his belief that the victims had not simply been murdered, but prepared. Their bodies had become instruments of a larger orchestration. He described the placement of organs, the repeated patterns of tissue removal, and the eerie similarity in the victim's internal arrangements. But then his voice shifted. He recounted a moment weeks prior, while reviewing Naomi Price's autopsy photos, when something clicked. He'd overlaid the arrangement of her organs onto a map of Belle Hollow, tracing each incision as if it were a directional line. The patterns matched not only the town's geography, but also the 5-point structure connecting all murder sites. He called it an anatomical map written in reverse, as if the killer had taken a human body and imposed it onto the land. Bell theorized that the killer wasn't mimicking ancient symbols. He was inverting them, using the body not as a victim, but as a mold. The earth had become flesh. The town had become a body. And each murder was not a random point, but a nerve ending. He spoke of nerve lines connecting places of death to places of ritual. He believed that Old Grove Hill was not just the geographic center of the symbol. It was the brain of the structure, the site that interpreted all others. He went further. Bell confessed that he had begun dreaming in patterns, that over the weeks he had studied the deaths, something had changed in his perception. He would wake in the middle of the night, seeing diagrams in the dark, lines overlaying his bedroom ceiling, organs labeled in languages he didn't recognize. He began referring to the killer not as a person, but as a geometric intelligence, a force that moved through a host, a design that had worn human skin. The most disturbing portion of the tape was Bell's description of the moment he stopped seeing the victims as individuals. He said their deaths were synchronized, that each girl was a note in a chord, and that Naomi was the final sound required to make the whole melody heard. He didn't describe this realization with horror, but with awe, as though he had crossed a threshold from horror into understanding. Then, in a quiet moment, he said something that chilled the investigators. "I thought I was studying the work, but I think I've been the audience. Maybe even the instrument. Maybe that's why I was shown so much." He described the final dream he had the night before recording the tape. In it, he stood on Old Grove Hill beneath the sky, cut into 5 equal pieces, each star above pulsing rhythm with his heartbeat. Below him, the ground was soft, breathing faintly. He could hear the earth humming in tones he could not describe, tones that matched the frequency of the butcher's incisions. The last words on the tape were delivered slowly, carefully, and with what sounded like calm resolution. "I am not afraid. Not anymore. When the body is completed, the heart opens. That is the final incision." The tape ended there. No click, no scuffle, just silence. Dr. Bell was never found. His disappearance was added to the case file, though authorities could not confirm whether he had fled, been taken, or walked willingly into whatever design he believed he had deciphered. But for the people of Belle Hollow, the tape became something worse than a clue. It was a mirror, a sign that even those tasked with decoding evil could become lost inside it. That knowledge was not always salvation. Sometimes it was surrender, and as the tape was replayed behind closed doors in the sheriff's office, a quiet, inescapable question settled over everyone who listened. Had the butcher been documenting his work all along, or had he been recruiting? The discovery of the tunnels beneath Belle Hollow was not the result of investigation, but accident. In early January of 1955, a water main rupture near the abandoned railway depot caused a partial collapse of the surrounding ground. What emerged beneath the fractured asphalt was not pipework, but stone, a narrow passage lined with brick and timber, too precise to be natural and too old to be recent construction. Workers initially assumed it was part of the original depot's infrastructure, a storage cellar or storm drainage. But when local historians arrived to assess the damage, what they uncovered reframed the entire understanding of the town's hidden history and its darkest horrors. The passage ran deeper than expected. Mapping efforts revealed an interconnected series of tunnels stretching nearly a mile in multiple directions, beneath the church, under the cemetery, toward the southern woods, and most disturbingly, in a direct line to Old Grove Hill. The layout was not erratic. It followed deliberate paths, symmetrical and calculated, reinforcing the now inescapable conclusion that the killer's actions had not been limited to the surface of Belle Hollow. He had been working beneath it as well. The tunnels were unlike typical mining routes or sewage lines. They were narrow, at times barely passable. Most were reinforced with hand-cut timber, others with stacked stone. In several chambers, investigators found rusted hooks embedded in the walls, heavy chains scattered on the floor, and old iron tools. Too corroded for modern use, but unmistakably forged with purpose. Some rooms were filled with bones, not human, but animal, arranged in concentric circles around charred fire pits, suggesting ceremonial use long before the recent killings began. Further exploration revealed markings, symbols carved into stone with obsessive consistency, the same circle with the X, over and over on walls, ceilings, even the floor. In one sealed alcove, investigators found a crude altar fashioned from old railway ties and stained wood. On it sat a weathered book, its leather cover marked with no title. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams, anatomical sketches, and page after page of phrases in Latin and Old English. The ink had faded, but one phrase repeated more than any other. In forma corpus, lux surgit. In the shape of the body, light rises. The tunnels were not just escape routes or hiding places. They were extensions of the design, physical conduits of a belief system hidden beneath the town's feet. Each corridor mimicked a body's vein, a nerve, or a bone. When overlaid onto the anatomical patterns Dr. Bell had theorized, the tunnel system aligned with terrifying precision. Old Grove Hill, once thought to be the center, now appeared to be the brainstem of an entire subterranean construct. The age of the tunnels predated the murders by decades, maybe even a century. Old property records and oral histories suggested that the original settlers of Belle Hollow may have been aware of them, even used them. Some speculated that a fringe religious sect, long erased from official documentation, had founded the early community with beliefs rooted in sacrifice, celestial alignment, and bodily transformation. If the Butcher had discovered this legacy, he hadn't created the darkness. He had inherited it. In one chamber beneath the hill, an old rusted bed frame was found bolted to the floor. Next to it, a wooden chair. Above both, a series of hooks embedded in the beams. Though there was no blood, no body, and no clear proof of recent use, the implication was enough. The chamber had been used for containment, possibly observation. Investigators concluded it may have been the site where at least one of the missing girls, perhaps Abigail, Claire, or Ruth, had been held, even if only temporarily. More chilling than any single chamber was the silence that filled the tunnels. No animals, no insects. The air was still, heavy with dust and time. Even electrical devices malfunctioned. Radios dropped signal, flashlights dimmed, and battery power meters gave erratic readings. Some swore they felt a low hum beneath their feet. Others claimed the walls seemed to breathe when left in darkness too long. Whether psychological or real, the effect was universal. No one who entered the tunnels wanted to stay. After several failed attempts to fully map the network, authorities sealed off the entrances. The excuse given publicly was safety, risk of collapse, gas leaks, mold. But privately, officials feared something worse. That the tunnels weren't just passageways, but conduits for influence. That they had allowed the Butcher or the force he served to move unseen, unheard, untouched. If the surface of Belle Hollow had been shaped like a body, then the tunnels were its nervous system, an invisible web carrying belief, fear, and control. Every victim's location, every symbol, every message had been part of a system that extended beneath the town's foundations. And in that system, the Butcher had never needed to run. He had always been inside. Father Thomas Whitley had long been considered the town's spiritual anchor, a man of deep silence, structured routines, and unwavering calm. Throughout the height of the Belle Hollow killings, he had maintained his composure, offering nightly vigils, comforting families, and fielding confessions that blurred the line between fear and guilt. But behind his composed exterior was a man wrestling with secrets far heavier than any sermon could absolve. His death in 1956 was ruled a heart attack, sudden and quiet, discovered in his modest rectory late one morning. But what emerged after his passing would become one of the most critical and unnerving revelations of the entire case. While sorting through his possessions, Father Whitley's successor found a locked wooden cabinet behind the church's organ. Inside were 4 reel-to-reel tapes, each labeled only with a date. No one had known of their existence. They were not parish records or liturgical recordings. They were private audio journals, personal documentation made over the course of several months during the height of the Butcher's reign of terror. The first recording was dated 2 days after Abigail Fenn's disappearance. The first tape began with silence, then the quiet clearing of Whitley's throat, followed by a subdued tone uncharacteristic of his usual sermons. He spoke of something that had begun to disturb him, not just the killings, but a strange pattern of confessions he received from unrelated individuals. These confessions bore similarities, references to light and shadow, dreams of bloodless death, and most notably, symbols that matched the circle with the X, which had not yet been made public. He speculated that either the killer was manipulating members of the congregation, or that the ideology behind the killings had been planted long ago, silently growing beneath the surface of the community. The second tape was darker. He described an incident in which a young man confessed not to a crime, but to a vision. The boy claimed he had seen the earth open beneath Belle Hollow and reveal a mouth of stone and veins of fire. He said the trees whispered names to him, names of the dead, and that one day the forest would stop hiding what it had seen. Whitley dismissed the confession at first as a hallucination or religious delusion, but when he asked the boy to draw what he had seen, the result was unmistakable. The exact geometric symbol found at multiple crime scenes. The priest began visiting locations around town where he believed spiritual energy was being manipulated. He spoke of Old Grove Hill, the tunnels, and even the cemetery. On the third tape, he mentioned a visit to a now-abandoned home near the outskirts of Belle Hollow, where he found dozens of hand-drawn diagrams pinned behind a child's wallpaper. The symbols were ancient, carved into the plaster beneath layers of paint. He suspected a previous occupant may have been connected to the foundation of something older, a belief system tied not to Christianity, but to pre-Christian rituals centered around the transformation of the soul through flesh. By the final recording, Whitley's voice had changed. He was still calm, but now deeply burdened, almost attached. He spoke of recurring dreams that mirrored those described by the town's victims before they vanished. He mentioned waking with dirt beneath his nails, despite not leaving the church grounds. In one chilling moment, he claimed that his nightly prayers were being answered, but not by God. He referenced a presence, ancient, formless, and hungry. He described it as a consciousness without mercy, older than fire, shaped in symmetry and silence. The final minutes of the tape consisted of a recitation, not scripture, but something else, words in a language not immediately recognizable. Linguists later identified portions as corrupted Latin, mixed with something closer to Enochian, a language historically associated with occult texts. The words seemed to align with the carvings found in the tunnels beneath the town. It was clear Whitley had not only studied the symbols, he had begun to speak them. There was no concluding message, no farewell, no statement of fear. The tape ended with a repeated phrase, spoken softly 10 times. He walks between breath. He names a hollow. Sheriff Elias Cutter had served Belle Hollow for over 25 years, a man of few words and iron routines. He was known more for his patience than his aggression. He had overseen petty crimes, domestic disputes, and the occasional lost hiker. But the Butcher shattered every precedent he had ever known. By the end of 1955, Cutter was a different man, haunted, gaunt, and visibly older. While his deputies chased dead ends and the FBI filtered everything through their national databases, Cutter built something else. A board, not for his team, not for the press, but for himself. It was housed in a locked back room of the old courthouse basement, behind stacks of outdated town records and yellowing maps. No one was permitted inside without his presence. The board stretched wall to wall, a chaotic web of yarn, pins, torn photographs, and newspaper clippings. At the center was a single black and white portrait of Abigail Fenn, her school ID pinned beneath it with a red thumbtack. Around her spiraled a network of connections so dense it resembled a neural map more than a crime chart. Cutter's theory, unspoken to public, was that the Butcher was not a man in the traditional sense, nor was he a serial killer in the pattern recognized by federal agents. He believed the entity responsible was parasitic, an ideology that infected minds like a virus and fed off the rituals of death, not for pleasure, but for structure. Every victim was not just a target, but a node. Every death was a message to something older than any living man. Cutter believed the killer wasn't acting alone, not in the physical sense, but in the cognitive. One corner of the board was labeled Dream Convergence. Beneath it, he had pinned written statements from surviving friends and relatives of the victims. Notes about recurring dreams, unexplained sleepwalking, or waking to find doors and windows unlocked. They all described similar visions: circles, bone geometry, shadowed forests, and a presence that watched but never moved. Cutter suspected the killer was not choosing his victims by sight or sound, but by subconscious resonance, people whose minds were already tuned to the same frequency. In the opposite corner, labeled Echoes, Cutter documented disappearances stretching back decades. Cases long considered accidents, runaway teens, or unresolved deaths from before the 1950s. Names like Mary Ann Giles, Lester Croft, and Miriam Yates appeared, their photos pinned alongside known victims. Though the records were incomplete, the patterns mirrored the recent killings too closely to ignore. Missing with no struggle, no sign of forced entry, always followed by odd behavior before vanishing. Cutter also noted changes in geography. He marked areas of the town where soil composition had shifted without cause, places where birds refused to nest, and zones where machinery failed with increasing frequency. He theorized that the design was influencing the land itself, reshaping it subtly to complete a larger structure. Roads built on ancient paths, churches unknowingly erected over old ritual sites. Cutter believed Belle Hollow had been founded atop a pattern that had always existed, waiting to be activated. Pinned dead center on the board was a copy of the Butcher's first known symbol, the circle with the X. Cutter had dozens of versions, collected from diary pages, carvings, clothing, even a chalk version found beneath a school desk. Around it, he had written a single phrase in red marker: communication, not signature. He believed the symbol was not merely a calling card, but a language, possibly even a coordinate system. The X marked convergence, the circle marked containment. Together, they implied an act of translation, turning the physical into the metaphysical. More controversial was the bottom left corner of the board, labeled Conduits. It listed names of individuals still alive, many of whom had confessed unusual dreams or displayed obsessive interest in the case. Some were respected citizens, teachers, pastors, even deputies. Cutter did not accuse them of complicity, but suspected that the ideology, like a virus, could replicate subtly, preparing hosts. He called them unlit torches. If ignited, they might carry the fire further. At the final edge of the board, a lone string connected all quadrants back to a single index card. On it, Cutter had typed one question: what if the Butcher isn't trying to kill Belle Hollow? What if he's trying to wake it? To Cutter, the evidence pointed not toward an end, but beginning. The rituals, the tunnels, the geometry, all of it aligned with ancient rites designed not for destruction, but transformation. The town was not the victim. It was the vessel. Every act of violence was a tap on the glass, a way to stir the sleeping mind of something buried long before the first settler laid stone. He presented none of this theory publicly. He knew it would destroy his credibility. But behind the courthouse door, the red string grew longer, more tangled, more precise. And in the final weeks of his tenure, Cutter spent most nights staring at the board, murmuring patterns to himself. He never solved the case, but he left behind something more important than a name or a face. He left a map, not of where the killer had been, but of what he had been building. Ruth Emerson had been missing for 147 days when she was found walking barefoot along the edge of Ash Creek Road. Her reappearance was as silent and inexplicable as her disappearance. No one saw who brought her. No vehicle was reported. No witnesses came forward. Just before dawn, a delivery driver spotted a pale figure, clothed in the same dress she wore the day she vanished, caked in dirt and dry blood, eyes wide but unfocused. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, as if waiting. At first, it was assumed she was in shock. The doctor spoke of trauma, dissociation, temporary muteness. But time passed, and Ruth never said a word, not to her parents, not to doctors, not even specialists brought in from out of town. She responded to stimuli. She blinked. She followed movement. But her silence remained absolute. She didn't seem frightened or resistant, just utterly detached. as if her return was not a rescue, but a relocation. Physically, she was emaciated but unscarred. No signs of violence. No bruises. No needle marks. The forensic examination found no internal injuries, no traces of sedatives, no signs of restraint. Yet her feet were badly lacerated, consistent with weeks of walking barefoot over sharp terrain. Her fingernails were blackened with soil, but not broken. Her hair had been crudely cut with something dull, leaving uneven patches and exposed scalp. Her teeth were intact, but worn down unnaturally, as if she'd been grinding them or biting something hard repeatedly. The most unsettling discovery came during the MRI scan. A small metal object, flat, circular, and embedded at the base of her spine, was detected beneath layers of scar tissue. Roughly the size of a coin, it bore no markings, no identifiable tech, and no logical reason for being there. It had fused with the tissue, making removal dangerous. It wasn't electronic. It wasn't surgical. It was simply there, inserted intentionally, purpose unknown. Its composition didn't match anything local, nor anything used in civilian or military implants at the time. Its purpose remains unsolved. Ruth's psychological evaluations revealed more questions. Her brain scan showed heightened activity in areas associated with auditory processing and spatial awareness. Yet she exhibited no reaction to sound or light that would suggest hypersensitivity. Instead, her gaze often drifted to blank corners of rooms, as if following silent instructions written in space. She responded most strongly to circles. She would trace them with her fingers across walls, bed sheets, her own skin. Always the same pattern. Clockwise, slowly, 5 times. Then she'd stop. Despite multiple efforts, no therapy produced progress. But her behavior began affecting those around her. Nurses complained of vivid nightmares after their shifts. One reported seeing the girl standing beside her car in the parking lot hours after she had been sedated. Several psychiatric staff resigned, citing atmospheric disturbances or feelings of dread around Ruth's room. One doctor who spent extensive time trying to break through her silence was later hospitalized for a nervous breakdown. His final session notes included the phrase, "She is not mute, she is listening." More inexplicable were the drawings. Ruth was eventually given crayons and blank paper as a form of nonverbal expression. Over several days, she produced more than 50 images, almost identical. Each depicted an overhead diagram of a body lying beneath intersecting lines. In every drawing, the lines converge at the base of the spine, the same location as the foreign object inside her. Some of the diagrams mirrored old architectural layouts from Belle Hollow's underground tunnels. Others matched the known victim locations when plotted over a deformed anatomical model. No one could explain how she knew. The authorities debated whether Ruth's reappearance was a breakthrough or a trap. Some believed she had escaped. Others suspected she had been released on purpose. There was no ransom, no demand, no message. Just a silent girl with knowledge far beyond her reach and a presence that unsettled even the most seasoned officers. Some called her a witness, others a messenger. As weeks passed, Ruth's behavior became increasingly ritualistic. She began stacking objects, books, utensils, pillows, into perfect pyramids and repeating the action every morning. If disrupted, she would calmly start again. Always 3 stacks, always facing north. When staff reversed the orientation of her bed, she stopped sleeping altogether for 4 days until it was returned. Her heartbeat remained steady. Her eyes never closed. After her return, reports of strange phenomena in Belle Hollow surged. Lights flickered across entire blocks without cause. Dogs barked at corners where no movement existed. Dreams were shared among strangers. The symbol, circle with X, began appearing again, carved into trees, drawn in condensation on glass, scratched into the paint on doors. Whether by coincidence or consequence, the butcher symbol had returned with Ruth. She remains in state custody. Her case is sealed, her location undisclosed. No further attempt to communicate have succeeded. But the last item she drew, found folded beneath her mattress, was not a diagram or symbol. It was a word, scrawled in uneven red, crayon across the page. Awakened. In the winter of 1956, long after the last official murder had been recorded and Ruth Emerson had vanished once again from public view. Strange reports began surfacing from amateur radio operators in the Appalachian region, across shortwave frequencies, particularly between 37.9 and 38.2 megahertz. A pattern of static pulses began to appear, brief distortions that at first were dismissed as atmospheric interference. But what set these apart was their consistency, and more disturbingly, their content. Within the static, voices emerged, not in language, but in fragmented sounds resembling human speech slowed to a crawl or sped into indecipherable high frequencies. Operators from as far as West Virginia to Tennessee logged identical sequences. 5 seconds of silence, then 13 seconds of chaotic modulation, followed by a pulse at a perfect interval of 2.14 seconds. This repeated every hour, always beginning at the 30-second mark. The transmissions had no known source. No call signs, no identifiers, no legal registry. Initially considered a technical anomaly, interest grew after one operator, a former military communications technician, used an oscilloscope to visualize the signal. What he captured chilled even seasoned engineers. The wave pattern formed a perfect loop spiral, a shape nearly identical to the underground symbols discovered in the Belle Hollow tunnels. When layered with other received signals, the lines overlapped and formed a rotating diagram, 5 points intersecting, a circle with a cross inside. It matched the Butcher symbol exactly. Word spread among underground networks of radio enthusiasts. A few began referring to it as the Hollow Pulse. Some claimed that when played in reverse at slowed speed, the signal produced phonemes that closely resembled early Anglo-Saxon speech. Others believed they heard chanting. One recording, later seized by federal agents, allegedly contained a clear whisper, saying a name long redacted from public record, Claire. The timing coincided with the anniversary of Claire Dorsey's disappearance. What separated the signal from typical interference was its response to observation. Multiple operators reported that the frequency shifted slightly when being actively recorded, like a predator aware of surveillance. Attempt to triangulate the origin failed. The signal strength remained equal across distant regions, behaving as though it originated from everywhere or nowhere. Then came the phenomenon known as the dead channel. At precisely 3:17 a.m. on the 17th of every month, the signal vanished for 60 seconds, not replaced by silence, but by absence. Receivers would not emit static, white noise, or even error codes. It was as if the channel had ceased to exist. Time slowed on devices tuned to it. Watches lagged. Tape reels spun unevenly. And when the signal returned, it came back stronger, louder, and faster, always accompanied by one new, disturbing element. A voice. It never repeated, never identified itself, but always spoke a sentence. Distorted, half-submerged in static, but unmistakably human. Logs from listeners capture fragments such as, "The circle is a wound. He walks between the blink. The skin remembers the sky." The final known broadcast, reported by 3 operators and transcribed independently, lasted 23 seconds and ended with a complete sentence, spoken in a deep, emotionless tone. "We are the hollow-born. You are the breathless host." After that night, most frequencies in the 37 megahertz range fell silent. Whether jammed, blocked, or simply abandoned, no one knows. Those who had listened closely began reporting dreams, shared themes of burial, fire beneath the soil, and a presence watching through glass. One ham operator from Virginia was hospitalized after claiming a voice from the static instructed him to dig beneath his basement. He found nothing. But weeks later, his wife discovered a circle burned into their floor, perfectly symmetrical, unexplainable by electrical malfunction or human error. When the FBI was notified of the signals, they launched a quiet investigation. Documents later uncovered through Freedom of Information requests revealed that agents had indeed visited multiple homes of shortwave operators, confiscated equipment, and labeled the case under an internal file. Frequency 5, Subconscious Influence Containment. The file was later merged with a larger case study that included the Belle Hollow murders. This confirmed what local authorities had long suspected but never said aloud. The signal was not just noise. It was a language, a method of influence. a continuation of the ritual through a new medium, no longer through flesh, symbols, or tunnels, but through air, through waveforms, through something that bypassed logic and moved directly into the brain. Cutter's theory about cognitive infection suddenly seemed more plausible. The butcher may not have been speaking through voice alone, but through rhythm, geometry, and now sound. What frightened investigators most was the possibility that the broadcasts were not the end of the ritual, but the beginning of the next phase, that the pattern had expanded, that the design had learned to speak beyond Belle Hollow, to reach beyond blood, to whisper into radios, and wait for someone to listen long enough to answer. In the spring of 1962, nearly a decade after the last known murder in Belle Hollow, a new and disturbing movement began to quietly take root in neighboring towns across the Appalachian corridor. It did not call itself a cult. It had no official name, no charter, no declared leader. But in time, those who investigated it came to refer to it as the Disciples of the Fifth Vein, a phrase derived from fragmented writings found in the tunnels beneath Belle Hollow and echoed in symbols uncovered during ritualistic investigations. The group began small, a cluster of individuals scattered across Kentucky, West Virginia, and northern Georgia. They were teachers, postmen, surveyors, nurses, people with no criminal records, no history of mental illness, and no public religious extremism. But they shared a common pattern. Each had a direct or familial link to Belle Hollow. Many were distant relatives of those who had vanished. Others had inherited homes, journals, or property near the center of the geometrical designs that once formed the pattern of death in the town. Most disturbingly, several had reported hearing a particular sound frequency, low, persistent, and impossible to record. The disciples did not meet in churches or temples. They gathered in abandoned buildings, barns, and deep woodland clearings. In one recovered film reel, shot secretly by a curious investigator hiding on a nearby ridge, a circle of robed figures is seen standing in perfect silence around a pentagonal frame made of bone and twine. Their heads are bowed, not in prayer, but in motionless stillness. The reel ends abruptly when the figure filming drops the camera, claiming later that the silence began pulsing and the trees vibrated with breath. The Fifth Vein was more than a name. In their sparse written texts, most scrawled in notebooks found decades later, it was referred to as a path beneath perception, the place where thought becomes shape. Members wrote of the sacred geometry, rooted in flesh, stone, and sound. They believed there were 5 veins beneath the earth, for the elements, and a fifth that carried memory and consciousness across time. The Belle Hollow design, according to them, had been a gateway open through symmetry and sacrifice. And once opened, it could not be closed, only nurtured, expanded, or replicated. Throughout 1962, disappearances began again, not in Belle Hollow, but in surrounding regions. Young girls, always between the ages of 11 and 15, vanished without signs of struggle. Some were last seen sleepwalking. Others complained of hearing voices and static, or seeing red spirals in their peripheral vision. No ransom notes, no remains. Just silence, echoing the same patterns as the butcher's early acts. One of the first public clues of the group's existence came during the investigation of an abandoned schoolhouse in Monroe County. Authorities, following reports of chanting and flickering lights, entered the building to find 5 concentric circles drawn in blood across the floorboards. At the center, a crude replica of the butcher's circle-like symbol, surrounded by animal bones arranged like vertebrae. On the walls, handprints and ash formed a perfect star pattern. No suspects were apprehended. No names were given. In a separate case later that year, a young boy was found wandering outside a gas station in Virginia, speaking in a monotone voice and covered in chalk dust. He kept repeating the phrase, "The Fifth Vein remembers. The bones must rise." He had no prior connection to Belle Hollow. His parents had never visited the region, but when shown a map of the town during psychiatric evaluation, he pointed directly at Old Grove Hill and said, "That's where it bled out." Federal authorities reopened several dormant files related to Belle Hollow. They began to piece together a disturbing possibility. The rituals had not ended. They had simply matured, gone underground in a new way, passed like a virus through belief, ancestry, and exposure to the earlier sites. The disciples of the Fifth Vein were not a cult in the traditional sense. They were interpreters of a blueprint, one left behind by the Butcher or by whatever intelligence had moved through him. The most damning evidence came in the form of a coded letter intercepted by postal inspectors. It was addressed to an unlisted recipient with no return address. Inside was a single page covered in numerical coordinates, geometric formulas, and a line of text written in mirrored script. When translated, it read, "It begins again beneath the new moon. The circle turns. The fifth opens." The FBI quietly placed several regions under surveillance, but the group proved elusive. No official arrests were ever made. The gatherings continued in secret, receding deeper into the woods, further from towns, beyond the reach of streetlights and suspicion. The disciples did not seek followers. They did not recruit. They waited, because they believed the structure had already been built, the design already written into the land, the body, and the mind. Their role was not to awaken it. Their role was to listen. And when the fifth vein pulsed again, they would know what to do. On the night of October 13th, 1963, the entire town of Belle Hollow experienced an unprecedented event, one that remains unexplained, unrecorded, and deeply feared by those who remember it. The power outage began at exactly 11:11 p.m. and lasted 7 hours. But it was not a normal blackout. There was no storm, no downlines, no transformer failure. Every electrical device simply stopped. Watches froze. Radios emitted a single low hum. Generators failed to turn over. Car engines stalled as if suffocated mid-breath. The town fell into a silence so complete that residents would later describe it as a vacuum. There was no moon that night. Heavy cloud cover obscured the stars, and the absence of all artificial light left Belle Hollow in absolute darkness. People lit candles and lanterns, but even flame behaved strangely, flickering in unnatural rhythms, bending away from windows, casting shadows that stretched in the wrong direction. Some residents reported hallucinations. Others described hearing a low-frequency vibration, like a heartbeat rising from beneath the ground. No two experiences were exactly alike, but all were united by one unshakable sensation, the feeling of being watched. The event came to be known as a fifth spiral, named after the 5 spiraling energy paths sketched in Father Whitley's recovered tapes and reinforced by Dr. Bell's anatomical mapping of the town. According to investigators who studied the case in secret, this night marked the final geometric alignment of the 5 original murder sites, the tunnels, and the town's underground veins. For reasons unknown, the date, time, and silence had activated something. In the following days, strange remnants were found scattered across Belle Hollow. Trees had split cleanly down the middle, without signs of lightning or rot. Dozens of birds were discovered in concentric rings on lawns and rooftops, their bodies intact, eyes open, facing outward. Old Grove Hill, long sealed off, was found disturbed. The topsoil had shifted into a spiral, as if drawn by a massive compass from above. No footprints, no tire tracks, just movement without cause. At the town central square, someone or something had drawn the circle with X symbol in ash across the pavement, measuring over 12 feet in diameter. Surveillance cameras, which were newly installed that month at the town hall, captured nothing. The tape recorded only static from 11:11 p.m. to 6:17 a.m. But when forensic technicians enhanced the audio, a faint rhythm emerged beneath the static, a sound almost identical to the radio pulse reported in 1956. A heartbeat, looping every 2.14 seconds. Residents began to report memory lapses. People claimed to have lost hours, some even entire days. A librarian found a journal entry in her own handwriting that she had no recollection of writing, containing phrases in Latin and rough sketches of the Belle Hollow symbol. Several students at the local school turned in art projects covered in spirals and black shapes with no explanation. One child drew a perfect top-down diagram of the town with 5 blood-red dots marking each known murder site, despite having no access to historical maps. Government investigators arrived within 48 hours. The official story cited a localized geomagnetic anomaly affecting electrical systems. Scientists offered no proof. The black box in the local radio tower, a new model installed to track frequency shifts, was confiscated and never returned. Those who asked questions were told it was classified. Rumors spread that a topographical scan done after blackout showed a subtle but measurable sinkage at the town center, as if something had pressed upward from beneath. The disciples of the fifth vein were nowhere to be found. Their suspected gathering spots were empty. But around the town's outskirts, 5 identical symbols were discovered carved into tree trunks, facing inward toward Belle Hollow. Each was fresh, each identical. Some residents interpreted this as a ward. Others believed it was a mark of closure, or of completion. Those who remained in Belle Hollow afterward claimed the town changed. Birds returned but never nested. Dogs refused to go near Old Grove Hill. Mirrors in certain homes would fog over on clear days. Some heard whispers through walls, always in unison, always just out of clarity. A few long-time locals moved away, claiming the air felt too still. Others stayed, convinced that whatever had happened on October 13th had ended the pattern once and for all. But there was one final anomaly. At sunrise on October 14th, exactly as the blackout ended, a new gravestone appeared in the town's cemetery. No records of its purchase, engraving, or delivery existed. It was made of dark stone not native to the region. The name etched into it was simple: The Hollow. No dates, no epitaph, no symbols. Just one phrase carved along the base: It is awake. Years have passed. Decades have folded quietly into dust. And yet, the name Belle Hollow continues to appear, whispered in academic corners, scribbled into the margins of fringe religious texts, referenced cryptically in forums that track unsolved mysteries. Officially, the case of the Butcher remains unresolved, unidentified, inactive, but silence does not mean resolution. It only means someone, somewhere, decided to stop asking questions. The town itself still exists, reduced now to a hushed population and scattered, aging structures. It doesn't appear on most modern maps. New developments seem to avoid it instinctively. GPS signals often scramble near its coordinates. Wildlife migrates around its perimeter. And those who try to visit, filmmakers, thrill seekers, amateur investigators, often report the same feeling upon entry: a pressure in the chest, a sensation being watched, and a strange compulsion to leave without ever fully understanding why. Some who stay longer speak of dreams. Always the same: a spiral narrowing to a black point, and then a whisper that seemed to come from their own voice. Others have documented sudden nosebleeds, blank spells, or intense deja vu. One journalist claimed she lost 3 hours while driving through the outskirts. When she checked her dash cam footage, it was a loop. 5 seconds replayed endlessly, the only sound a low ticking like a grandfather clock underwater. A handful of modern scholars have attempted to tie the events of Belle Hollow to other incidents around the world. Similar patterns of ritualistic geometry, underground tunnel systems, and mass disappearances without evidence. They point to symbols that match the circle with the X, found carved into trees in the Black Forest of Germany, painted on stones in Peru, burned into floors of abandoned homes in Siberia. These connections, while speculative, suggest that Belle Hollow was not unique. It was simply the most complete. The phrase fifth vein has entered niche lexicons of occult literature. It's referred to as an axis of transformation, a bridge between body and memory, ritual and matter. Some believe that once awakened, the fifth vein cannot be closed, that it rewrites the environment slowly, converting biology into design. There are rumors that certain architectural firms have encountered its dimensions unknowingly, buildings that collapse without structural cause, blueprints that seem to draw themselves, proportions that feel too perfect. In these places, workers grow ill, families move out, and soon after, the buildings are demolished and forgotten. As for the victims, their names remain etched in stone, but their stories grow increasingly abstract. Over time, they become symbols: Abigail, Claire, Ruth, and the others. Their faces, once central to local grief, are now shrouded in myth. Each had traits in common: sensitivity, recurring dreams, artistic skill, or a strange fascination with patterns. Retrospectively, they are described not as chosen, but resonant, drawn into a frequency that had always been there beneath the soil. The Butcher remains unnamed. Some argue there never was a single killer. that the crimes were acts committed by different individuals under the influence of shared force. Others believe the Butcher was merely the first vessel a conductor who stumbled upon, or was led to, the diagram beneath Belle Hollow. If that's true, then the real culprit was never human. It was a system, an idea, a parasite of thought that required ritual and symmetry to manifest. A quiet file remains locked away in federal archives, known to a select few under the internal code Echo V5. It contains reports from engineers, linguists, biologists, and physicists, each describing anomalies that defy their fields. One entry from 1979 references a phenomenon called topological imprinting, the process by which physical environments are altered by repeated exposure to ritual intent. It claims that certain materials retain memory not just in structure, but in direction. That Belle Hollow may have become sentient, not in the way a mind thinks, but in how a shape remembers. Even now, strange incidents still occur. A man in Vermont claimed his daughter spoke fluently in reverse Latin after wandering into a spiral-shaped meadow. A hiker in Oregon found a stone altered deep in the woods, marked with an exact replica of the Belle Hollow symbol, burned into the rock, as if by impossible heat. A retired sheriff in Tennessee received an anonymous package containing an old map of Belle Hollow, updated with new red pins, none of which correspond to past crimes. All are dated for future years. The silence remains, not because it is over, but because it has changed. Those who know what to look for understand this is no longer about murders. It's about transmission, echoes that build until something answers. The ritual never needed crowds, only listeners. And now, with every connected device, every audio waveform, every spiral unknowingly drawn in notebooks and crop fields, the design expands. The circle was never a wound. It was an opening, and someone, somewhere, is still keeping the silence. Because the moment it is broken, it may speak back. Some stories fade with time, but this one, it never stopped. The Butcher was never caught, because maybe he was never meant to be, and Belle Hollow, it still breathes. In every whisper, every shadow, every silence that grows just a little too deep. If you're still listening, you've already heard it. The Hollow is awake, and it's waiting for you. Bell subscribe for more unsolved horrors, buried truths, and the darkness they don't want you to remember. Speech Balloon, have you ever heard the whispers? Comment below what you believe is behind the Hollow. Thumbs up like if you made it to the end. And remember, some doors were never meant to be reopened. _ We'll see you in the silence.